Power does not emerge from chaos. It emerges from the management of chaos. In the centuries before 3100 BCE, the Nile Valley became a crucible where environmental collapse forced scattered tribes into a narrow corridor of survival. And from that compression came not cooperation, but conquest. What followed was not the birth of a nation, but the invention of divinity as statecraft, and the transformation of warlords into gods. The world along the Nile before 5500 BCE belonged to no one because it belonged to everyone. When the last ice age released its grip, the Sahara bloomed into grassland. Elephants and giraffes moved through savannas where today only sand exists. Tribes followed the herds, carrying domesticated cattle as insurance against lean seasons, but never settling, never accumulating, never organizing beyond the hunting band. There was no reason to. The land gave freely. When game migrated, people migrated. When conflicts arose, distance resolved them. The Nile itself was irrelevant, a violent, unpredictable torrent cascading from Ethiopian glaciers, carving gorges, flooding without pattern. Its banks offered no advantage over the open grasslands. Men lived where animals lived, and animals lived where rain fell. The river was simply another feature of the landscape, neither sacred nor strategic. Leadership existed only in moments. A successful hunter gained prestige during the feast, then dissolved back into equality when the meat was consumed. This was power without structure, authority without permanence. But the world was warming, and warming does not distribute its consequences equally. Around 5500 BCE, the Saharan rivers began to thin. The great seasonal migrations of game grew shorter, then stopped. Grasslands turned to scrub, scrub to hardpan. The wadis, those ancient riverbeds that once carried water from the highlands to the Mediterranean, went dry and stayed dry. The Sahara was not dying slowly. It was collapsing with geological speed. Within a millennium, half of North Africa became uninhabitable. The tribes had two choices: follow the dying herds into extinction, or move toward the one permanent water source that remained. They chose the Nile. Not as a conscious migration. There were no planning councils, no collective decisions, but as a compression. Year by year, the habitable zone shrank. Villages that once sat 50 miles apart found themselves neighbors. Hunting territories that once stretched to the horizon condensed into riverbank plots measured in acres. For the first time, leaving was not an option. The desert had become a wall. This was the first crisis, and from crisis came the first permanent power. When men cannot move away from each other, they must either organize or eliminate. The Nile's annual flood imposed a rhythm that hunting never had. Each summer, as Sirius reappeared in the pre-dawn sky on the 17th of July, the river swelled. Waters the color of rust poured down from Ethiopia, carrying topsoil stripped from volcanic highlands. The flood consumed the valley, transforming the landscape into a shallow sea dotted with refuge mounds. Then, weeks later, the waters receded, leaving behind a layer of black silt so fertile that grain barely needed cultivation, merely broadcast seed, let cattle trample it into the mud, and wait. The yields were obscene. A farmer in Mesopotamia celebrated harvests of 3 grains for every 1 planted. In Egypt, 20 grains returned for every seed. 20. No irrigation canals were necessary, no complex labor coordination, no hydraulic bureaucracy. Just wait for the flood, plant when it recedes, harvest when it ripens. This should have created equality. When the land gives equally to all, no one has leverage. But the flood also created something else: granaries. Grain stores through seasons. Grain travels. Grain measures wealth in a way that game never could. And most critically, grain rots if not defended. By 4000 BCE, the villages clustering along the Nile were no longer egalitarian hunting camps. They were agricultural settlements with surpluses, and surpluses require guardians. Those guardians became warlords, and those warlords became chiefs, and those chiefs began to look at neighboring villages not as fellow survivors, but as competitors for floodplain and as sources of slaves for labor. The mechanism of early power was simple: boats. The Nile flowed north, but winds blew south, meaning a vessel could sail upstream with sails raised and drift downstream with sails furled. A man who controlled a fleet controlled mobility, and mobility was violence. The first warrior elites were river pirates, boats and gangs, boat crews and raiding bands, who struck fast and vanished. They took grain, took women, took cattle, and returned to their fortified mounds. Defense was nearly impossible. The Nile offered too many approach vectors. The only counter was a larger fleet, which required more men, which required more grain stores, which required more land, which required conquest. By 3500 BCE, the Nile was no longer a series of isolated villages, but a patchwork of proto-states, each centered on a cult temple. These were not cities, populations rarely exceeded 5,000, but they functioned as political cores. Hierakonpolis in the south, Thinis near Abydos, Nagada in the Central Valley. Each commanded a stretch of river, each maintained a war fleet, and each identified with a totemic deity. Hierakonpolis worshipped Horus, the falcon. Nagada venerated Set, god of storms and chaos. Other centers claimed Hathor the cow, Sobek the crocodile, Thoth the ibis. But these were not gods in the way later religion understood gods. They were ancestors, allies, emblems. A chief did not pray to Horus for favor. He was Horus incarnate. The falcon did not watch over the tribe, it was the tribe, given human form in the chief's body. This was totemic fusion, the oldest form of African power theology, and it had a brutal political logic. If the chief is the god made flesh, then rebellion against the chief is rebellion against the cosmos itself. Disobedience becomes blasphemy. Defeat becomes theological proof of weakness. Victory becomes divine mandate. The turning point came not from military innovation, but from ideological synthesis. Hierakonpolis, perched high on the Nile where the flood was predictable and the valley narrow, developed the most sophisticated cosmology. Their priests wove the scattered tribal myths into a unified narrative. In the beginning, only primordial water, Noon, existed. From it rose the first mound of earth, conveniently located at Hierakonpolis itself. On that mound stood Atum, the creator, who masturbated the universe into being. Later theologians would revise this to speaking creation into existence, but the original myth was unambiguous about the method. From Atum came Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, who birthed Geb, earth, and Nut, sky, who in turn produced the critical quartet: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Osiris, the eldest, brought civilization, agriculture, law, beer brewing. He ruled justly, teaching humanity to plant barley and worship the gods. But his brother Set, jealous and chaotic, murdered him, dismembered his body, and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Isis, Osiris's sister wife, gathered the fragments and resurrected him long enough to conceive a son, Horus. When Horus matured, he waged war against Set to reclaim his father's throne. The battle was eternal, the struggle unending, because chaos could never be fully destroyed, only contained. This was not mythology. This was political theory. Every element mapped onto contemporary power struggles. The Nile's flood was Osiris reborn. The desert's encroachment was Set's chaos. The king was Horus, eternally fighting to preserve Ma'at, cosmic order, justice, balance, against Isfet, chaos and entropy. And here was the genius. Defeated enemies were not destroyed, but integrated. Set remained in the pantheon. Chaos had a place in the divine order, which meant Set-worshipping rivals could be absorbed rather than annihilated. Victory became unification, not extermination. By 3200 BCE, Hierakonpolis had weaponized this narrative. Their rulers, bearing names like Scorpion, Hor, Ka, launched campaigns not as conquests, but as restorations of cosmic order. When Scorpion attacked a rival settlement, his priests proclaimed he was subduing agents of Set. When Hor demanded tribute, it was not theft, but the rightful due of Horus incarnate. The famous Scorpion mace head, carved in limestone, depicts the king performing the first furrow ritual, digging the ceremonial opening of an irrigation canal. He is not merely a warlord, but the mediator between heaven and earth, the one who commands the Nile to rise and the fields to yield. Without his ritual intervention, the cosmos would collapse. This ideological supremacy proved decisive. Hierakonpolis did not have the largest population, or the richest gold mines, or the most warships. What it had was a story that made resistance seem cosmically futile. Rival chiefs who submitted were not conquered, but restored to Ma'at. They kept their titles, their lands, their gods, but now served under Horus's supreme authority. The nome system emerged from this. 42 districts, each governed by a hereditary chief, nomarch, each centered on a local temple, each preserving its traditional deity, but subordinate to the Horus cult. Power flowed not through bureaucratic chains, but through ritual consensus. Nomarchs pledged loyalty in temple ceremonies, and the king validated their authority in return. Military force remained essential, but it was no longer sufficient. The proto-dynasties of Scorpion and Ka waged relentless wars, absorbing Thinis, Abydos, Nagata, and the southern nomes. But their victories stuck because ideology made them irreversible. Around 3200 BCE, another innovation solidified this: writing. Not writing as record-keeping, Mesopotamia had invented that centuries earlier, but writing as magic. Hieroglyphics emerged not for accounting, but for permanence. A king's name, inscribed in the Serek, the royal cartouche, a rectangular frame topped by a Horus falcon, became an eternal entity. To speak the name was to invoke the god. To erase it was to annihilate the soul. Scribes became priests. Literacy became power. The unification wars climaxed under Narmer, the last pre-dynastic king and possibly the first pharaoh of Dynasty I. Some sources conflate him with Hor-Aha, also called Menes, but the historical record blurs here. Narmer inherited a unified Upper Egypt, the southern valley from the First Cataract to the Fayum oasis. Lower Egypt, the marshy, fragmented delta, remained independent, a patchwork of Set-worshipping chiefdoms. Narmer's solution was not subtle. The famous Narmer palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis, depicts him in the canonical pose of pharaonic power. One hand gripping a mace raised overhead, the other seizing an enemy by the hair, about to deliver the killing blow. Horus, in falcon form, perches above, legitimizing the violence. On the reverse, Narmer inspects rows of decapitated corpses, their heads placed between their legs. The inscription claims 120,000 captives taken from Lower Egypt, almost certainly inflated, but reflecting mass demographic displacement. This was not purely military conquest. The drying Sahara had driven climate refugees into the delta. Narmer's armies captured them en masse and resettled them as laborers on royal estates. Slavery, previously rare, became systemic. A new social caste emerged, Meretu, those with broken wings, depicted in hieroglyphics as a falcon with shattered pinions. They were no longer prisoners to be ransomed or expelled, but a permanent underclass, and their subjugation required ideological justification. They were enemies of Ma'at, their bondage a cosmic necessity. Narmer adopted the cent, the double crown. The white conical crown of Upper Egypt merged with the red cylindrical crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing unification before full integration was achieved. This was propaganda, but propaganda that worked. Lower Egyptian chiefs, seeing the inevitability of Hierakonpolis dominance and the cosmological framework that would preserve their local authority, submitted. Set remained in the pantheon. Chaos was necessary, contained but not destroyed. The nome system extended northward. Egypt became, for the first time, a single polity under a single divine ruler. The structural transformation. What Narmer forged was not a kingdom in the Mesopotamian sense. No bureaucratic apparatus, no written law codes, no merchant class, no standing army. It was a ritual confederation held together by ideological hegemony and the king's divine monopoly on cosmic maintenance. The pharaoh did not rule through governors, but through performative theology, opening the first furrow, offering to the Nile, conducting the Heb-Sed festival to renew his divine vitality. His power was not administrative, but incarnational. He was not appointed by the gods, but was a god. Horus made flesh, eternally battling Set to preserve Ma'at. The economic base remained simple. Agricultural surplus required no redistribution bureaucracy. Temples stored grain, nomarchs paid tribute in kind. Royal estates, worked by Meretiu, produced wealth for the crown. Trade enriched the elite, but was never central. Gold and ivory from Nubia, copper from Sinai, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan via Mesopotamian middlemen. But Egypt remained fundamentally autarkic. Foreigners were mistrusted. Foreign conquest beyond securing trade routes held no appeal. Egypt was life, the desert was death, the world beyond was chaos. Social stratification hardened into three castes: Hennemut, solar people, the warrior aristocracy, free commoners, and Meretiu, slaves. Mobility between castes was theoretically possible, but rare. The elite invested in elaborate tombs, mummification, grave goods. Ensuring eternal life required enormous wealth. Commoners were buried face west toward the Sahara, the land of the dead, with minimal ritual. The afterlife became the ultimate assertion of inequality. The rich lived forever, the poor dissolved into the sand. This structure proved astonishingly stable. The ideological synthesis of pre-dynastic Egypt, Horus versus Set, Ma'at versus Isfet, the king as divine mediator, persisted for 3,000 years. Dynasties rose and fell, invasions came and went, but the cosmological framework endured. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom, built centuries later, expressed the same logic. The king must be preserved eternally in a perfected body, tomb as palace, to maintain cosmic order. The roots of that obsession lay in the pre-dynastic compression crisis, when desperate tribes fleeing the dying Sahara forged a new identity around the Nile's divine rhythm. Narmer's conquest was not the end of the unification process, but its beginning. True integration took generations. Lower Egypt retained distinct customs, dialects, gods. The delta's swampy terrain resisted centralization. Nome loyalties remained primary. The concept of Egypt as a unified identity was elite ideology, not popular consciousness. But the structure held because it offered something no rival system could: cosmic inevitability. Resistance to the pharaoh was not rebellion but heresy, not politics but madness. The Horus kings of Hierakonpolis did not conquer Egypt. They restored it from chaos. This was power's ultimate form, not the monopoly of violence, but the monopoly of meaning. Military force won battles, ideology won civilizations. Narmer's mace crushed skulls, but Hierakonpolis's cosmology crushed the possibility of resistance itself. Future pharaohs would claim descent from the gods, erect monuments to dwarf human scale, command labor on projects serving no purpose beyond demonstrating divine omnipotence. But all of it traced back to the pre-dynastic synthesis, the invention of kingship not as office, but as incarnation, authority not as delegation, but as cosmic necessity. The Nile had always flooded, Sirius had always risen, grain had always grown. But before Narmer, these were facts of nature. After Narmer, they were facts of theology, dependent on the king's ritual performance, proof of his divine essence. The river obeyed not because water flows downhill, but because Horus commanded it. Harvests came not from planting, but from the pharaoh's intercession with the gods. And if crops failed, if the Nile flooded too little or too much, the explanation was clear. Ma'at had been violated, chaos had encroached, and the king must perform greater rituals, build larger monuments, make grander offerings to restore balance. This was the machinery of power pre-dynastic Egypt bequeathed to history, an ideology so totalizing that even failure reinforced it, so self-justifying that rebellion confirmed the king's necessity. The warlords who once raided from boats became gods who commanded the cosmos. The river that once meant nothing became the axis of existence, and the tribes who once roamed free became subjects who could never leave, could never imagine leaving, because beyond the Nile lay only death, and only the pharaoh stood between them and the chaos waiting in the sand.